So there were a couple of things I wanted to mention to you that were in the context of the workshop um, that connect to the question of the coronavirus and social credit system and China. Now, one of them is that this what we talked about before about the way in which there are now these color-coded uh, apps that are integrating different kinds of information to have an effect on people's daily lives. It's interesting how this links laboratory tests to social tests,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because some of the information is certainly based on testing. Now, not enough people have been tested to make this universal, but if you have been tested, there is certainly the desire to make those test results part of the data that would determine your
Mm-hmm.
score. So you have laboratory tests, both the kind that look for the presence of the virus and the kind that looks for antibodies.
Mm-hmm.
And those kinds of tests then are being connected to all of these social tests about trust, about what you can and cannot do and should not do um, in a very interesting way through this interface of the technology.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that was one point I wanted to make. And
Just
I,
on that one,
yeah,
Jonathan. So the results of the COVID virus test, whichever one it is, but maybe even more importantly, maybe which one it is, because one is you could be tested and found that you have the infection and you are infectious. You could be
right,
tested and found that you do not have the virus and you are still at risk of being infected. Or you could be tested, presumably they will have such tests and maybe in mass quantities, and found that you not only had the virus, but are now immune. And so the red kind of and green that we saw in the first moment might mean something a little bit different now, because red could be infectious, yellow means you are still at risk of being infected, and green now in this case means you are immune, and therefore quite
right.
a different kind of relation. But the same system with the same cards, the same swipe throughs could be in place.
That's right. And it's really interesting because at this point, since the COVID-19 testing is not sufficient, um, really what the red, yellow, green is showing are risk factors. Although in some cases, you must assume that it includes medical data. Um, but at the point at which it really is reflecting the outcome of the laboratory test, then these your social test is a kind of a test by proxy of these laboratory tests, right? What kind of behavior you do. Um, and for example, if you are right now with the uncertainty as to what puts you more at risk, there have been some reports of people not wanting to use bike shares because they know that that bike share information goes into their social credit system score, and that means that they're moving around, and they think that that might reduce their score because simply moving is considered to be potentially risky.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh.
But this question of what's a proxy for another kind of test, I think, for the
Yeah.
larger question of the sociology of testing is an
Mm-hmm.
important point and an interesting area to look into more.
So if I get that, it's not just that you might have a score and it's red, green, yellow, infectious, not yet infected, and immune, but which are kind of like dummy variables, if you want to think about it that way. But rather that there is a composite of various kinds of behaviors which makes you a more risky person or a more trusted person in the in the health case itself. So do you move, as you just said, do you move
Right.
around a lot, or who have you been near? Have you been in the same space with someone who is in a higher risk category? So it's a set of variables as opposed to just red, green, or yellow.
Right. And what's interesting is that,
Mhm.
unlike the kind of testing that has to do with scoring in general for educational tests, say SATs or something like that, and more similar to the home pregnancy test, or very similar to the home pregnancy test. This is one of those cases that really links the more conventional understanding of test in a laboratory, in a scientific testing form, with social tests. Because for the social credit system, it's a test of the system as a whole and a test of each individual within that system to see whether they can learn and whether they can comply.
Uh-huh.
So you're mixing here laboratory testing and social testing in really interesting and kind of unprecedented ways, especially at scale.
Mhm.
And you can add to that the problem that a lot of the tests at this point, the actual scientific tests,
Mhm.
are unreliable because there's a high percentage of false negatives. Uh, and you also have the additional problem of compromised tests, fake tests, false tests, which of course would fall under the social credit system punishment category, but nonetheless seem to really be out there.
Mhm.
Test kits that only have a 30% accuracy rate instead of the advertised 80% accuracy rate, for
Uh-huh.
example.
Uh-huh. What would be another example? You mentioned this people avoiding bike shares because if you were on a bike share, it showed that you were moving around in the city of a behavior that could be captured in your, let's call it your card, your pass, that might indicate you're at a higher risk, but it's not itself based on a direct blood or saliva test.
Well, this is exactly what's not really known. And so there's only a lot of speculation
Uh-huh,
about it.
uh-huh.
One must assume that, as you had mentioned at an earlier point, even the way in which you text messages to your friends uh, would have to have some kind of bearing on this. It's fairly well assumed that within the social credit system more generally, your positivity or negativity about certain issues, including, say, politics or the Communist Party, would have an impact on your score. So it's possible to think that different kinds of risk are not only your risky behavior, but also your risk to the society. So one example of that, that apparently seems to be active, is the risk of spreading rumors. If you are somebody who is considered to be at risk of spreading rumors, as defined by the government, that would be an indication that perhaps there should be some restrictions on your mobility. And that's not necessarily purely a health issue, except that it's interpreted as a health issue because if the rumors are deemed to be deleterious to people's ability to protect themselves, then that's a public health issue, not just a political issue. Of
Yeah.
course, there's a lot of room for political manipulation within that as well.
Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. You had a couple other points that you to make. I interrupted you. Sorry. Mm-hmm.
Um, yes. So a point that's related to this
Yeah.
is, from what I can tell, it seems like because there's so many local variations on the kinds of monitoring and tracking for COVID-19, either risk or actually being infected, that what happens is a kind of what you might call a game of test telephone. In other words, what the information means uh, gets interpreted differently at all kinds of different levels. whether it's the guard at the entrance to the shopping mall or grocery store, or the person letting you on or off the highway in your car, or perhaps your employer trying to figure out whether or not you can come back to work. And one of the most interesting aspects of this development, I think, is that you have a real hybrid system that has emerged where technology only works in conjunction with good old-fashioned human labor and enforcement. Right? The app is only as good as the people who are there to interpret the data on the app or to even enforce the entrance or exit. And the most effective ways in which mobility has been controlled has been through neighborhood watch type groups, small groups, in groups, villages, where their own members will control entrance and exit, sometimes based on very non-technological, old-fashioned codes, such as the one that was also reported in the news where a village outside of Wuhan would get people to test as to whether they spoke the local dialect or not in order to let them into the village. So you're contrasting your QR code on your iPhone with the person asking you to say a sentence and to see whether you can speak the local dialect. And I think that kind of captures that range that we have now going on here. And it's very interesting to see how that plays out.
Well, it's not exactly the Rhode Island state trooper checking whether you're entered the state from New York City or not, but it could be a kind of Chinese variant of it, I'm afraid. Yeah.
That's right. I mean, the other thing which you have is this technology question, because all of the technology information gets fed back into this larger big data system. Apparently now there is facial recognition that supposedly works with face masks. Originally it didn't. There are so-called smart helmets where supposedly from a distance, a person wearing that helmet can both take your temperature and have your image and transmit that. So police could be wearing those.
Oh my.
It's not very clear that all these things really work. And it should be noted that even the apps on the phones are by no means foolproof. There are stories of people borrowing other people's phones. Right? And conversely, there are stories of people who had lent their phone to someone else and they had actually not traveled. And then, of course, it's never been very difficult to get phones and SIM cards on the black market. I would imagine that there are ways that you could have multiple phones and only one of them is registered to get those codes. However, if you couldn't show any code, maybe you wouldn't be allowed to move either. So not quite as easy as that. But it's a very porous system. But it does show a lot of potential for how a lot of this technology and tracking can be adapted beyond China as well.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, the regions not in China that were not Wuhan or at the kind of hotspot center did manage to keep the virus quite contained. Is that right?
It seems to be that way. In cities like Shenzhen, there's now a gradual loosening of restrictions. Some places still have more restrictions than others. There's obviously concern that the data is incomplete and that there might be a lot of cases that are not being tracked or not known. But as far as the official information goes, it does seem like the really brutal at times lockdown of Hubei province and Wuhan in particular did prevent some measure of the virus spreading, although not entirely. Now, these codes and these behavioral modifications will be absolutely central in trying to reopen the Chinese economy, because without any way of being able to contact trace new clusters,
Mhm.
and without any way of trying to control the movement of people, it will be really impossible to say whether or not things are under control.
Mhm.
So what you're seeing is a kind of a total test environment as a biopolitical economy at a national scale. And this is really biopolitics at a new register. I would say it's
Mhm.
really a biopolitical economy because it's about allowing economic activity. It's also about tracking economic activity, and it's about giving incentives and disincentives for participating in certain kinds of economic activity, tying it all to the biological aspect of are you infected, are you not infected, are you in the future, hopefully we will know immune or not immune, and are you at risk or are you not at risk. So it's a really interesting way in which uh, an already existing system of population control is being extended nationwide, but in order to enable rather than restrict at this point. And that's a very big difference. I think initially what you saw in Wuhan and in some of and in Zhejiang and other places was the development of this technology in order to restrict. To the extent to which the virus is under control and is not coming back, what you're seeing is the next stage in this technology is how to enable.
Mhm.